Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Truvle podcast. Sam here.
And John over here. And very exciting because we have our first user question. So there was a question as to whether or not Sam and I are anti-consultant. Because of our first podcast, we seem to come off a little strong. And we made clear, but obviously I guess we didn't, that we're not anti-consultant. Some of our best friends are consultants. We consult.
I'm a consultant.
So no, that's not the issue. I think what we've been trying to say is the consultants are part of a broader ecosystem that clearly has a problem and clearly doesn't know how to solve it. And a lot of these problems that we're discussing, we're really not pointing our finger anywhere so much as trying to show the underlying root problems and how they could start to be addressed. So I don't know, Sam, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, business maturity. What we're talking about is consultants. Our first podcast is about consultants are brought in a lot of times because there's an immature business conversation happening and it doesn't end up serving either the business or the consultant. Well, the consultants usually get their fees and they're doing okay. But generally consultants are part of a business too. And if the self-awareness and the maturity of a consulting practice is also low, they're just contributing in a way that's also causing probably more problems than the market is getting benefit from. And that is just encompassed in all of the problems we talk about. So our angle is more that we're contributing consulting knowledge in a way that brings the classic or conventional or current consulting model into question. But it's the same rigor in which we call all business practice into question, I'd say. So I wouldn't say that consultants are being called out in a particularly negative way, although we are saying they tend to hide a lot of organizational dysfunction because of the nature of how they engage.
And I think that reminds me of a follow-up question was, are we just talking about strategy consultants? Are we talking about all consultants? Because many consultants are very specialized in a given area. And I would say absolutely not. Our comments are pretty universal.
Yeah, all types of consulting. The relationship is such that, and we don't have to rehash it, all of it, but everyone's trying to do their best, but the consulting relationship in the current state does not lend itself to effective, sustainable, scalable, mature business outcomes is more what we're positing. Not attributing that to any particular person or consultant, it's just the observation.
Okay, so maybe a little bit of a dig at the consultants, but I think that topic lends itself perfectly, or that is a perfect segue into our current topic, because if you're organizationally immature, you probably shouldn't be trying to do, as we've been saying, too many of these big projects or things that you might otherwise need consultants for. And you really should be focusing on your operations, which is our topic for today. And Sam, I'll let you take a stab at the definition of operations, but I think that's actually part of our broader conversation.
Right. Well, before we even, the topic of operations, we have to start with what is it? So Jonathan very graciously passed it over to me to define, but I would first start by saying the problem is that there is no standard definition. And that's what I'm very passionate, you'll find, about talking about definitions in general, because I think a lot of business terms are very charged, very ambiguous. And I've sat in rooms where three people will say the exact same term in the same conversation and all mean different things. And no one will even call into question what each other means. They just all say, yes, I understand you, when they clearly could not possibly, because they're using words like operations, process, strategy. These words are so packed and you have to actually sit down and define them. But operations is a big one. And it's an important topic because it is a specific type of process, an operating or an operations process. And if you can't differentiate in your organization, or every organization you go into means something else when they say, this is ops, this is our ops team, this is our operations, this is our operations budget, this is our operations management, this is our operations improvement plan. What is an operation? So I just, before I started to define it, I wanted to call attention to the reason that we're even trying to define it, or we're going to talk about it today, is because it's not as clear as you might think. It might be clear in your own organization.
If you Google the definition of operations, you're going to see things like anything that creates value for an organization. That's a pretty broad definition. Pretty hard to use that word in any meaningful way if that's your definition.
And my definition, let me try the one that's most true to me first, and then we'll break it down. To me, the operations is the collection of operating processes that create your revenue stream, the core revenue stream of the business. So any process that directly results in revenue generating activities for the business. And again, I'm even being careful now because when I say revenue generating activities, even that can be very ambiguous. But what we're talking about is any process that directly creates a value producing result that a consumer is engaging with and validating that it actually provides a consumer benefit. Let's put it that way. So your core ops is the beating heart of the business. It's what drives your energy as a business, all the finances that keep you alive and actually give you enough revenue to have discretionary spending, either on shared services or outside consultants or project work, et cetera. And typically operations are repetitive, but again, just being very, keep me honest, Jonathan, because I know now I'm nervous
Well,
because we looked at definitions for over an hour and you don't want to conflate.
I
There's a lot of
think,
pieces.
yeah, I think the key is there's two aspects in what Sam's saying. One is when we're talking about things that are creating value or part of whatever value the entity is creating, then you could really start, at least just from that. That's one element of the definition, that you could start seeing those parts of the organization that are not actually helping. Let's say it's a car manufacturing, the HR department or marketing department, they have operations, but they're part of shared services or corporate services or the like. So there's a distinction between certain activity that's occurring that's actually contributing directly to the value that the organization's providing to the market. But I think the most important element of the definition that we want to talk about today is how to distinguish between operations and projects. So I think let's limit the scope of the definition for that purpose, because that makes it, that becomes very useful in a multitude of ways. I mean, I don't know what you think of that, Sam.
It's fundamental. That's absolutely correct. The reason we're driving toward it, and I started to stumble on definition a little because I'm so passionate about you guys being able to separate them. So I don't want to give you anything that, again, I become part of the problem and you walk away from this podcast and say, oh, well, Sam said it's this. And then you start propagating ambiguity, even just with your own sort of assimilated definition. So, so in that sense, I want everyone to be very precise on their definitions in the business world as much as possible. But the point of that is so that we can do what Jonathan just said, which is if I go into a business environment, I can view a collection of activity, identify it as process, and separate operating processes versus project processes. Because fundamentally, those are the two main process species, let me say, to use more colorful or evocative language, they're going to find out in the wild. And they have to be handled differently. They have to be managed differently. They have to be funded differently. They have to be measured and assessed differently. And if you can't make the distinction because you don't know what an operation is technically, or a project is technically, then everything is just activity. So that distinction is extremely important. And to define and to make things distinct, you have to have a very clear idea of what their definitions are. And that's why this conversation about operations and what is it was very important.
And so let's just get into some of the basics of the distinction between what's an operation and what's a project. So Sam started off,
And that will be the whole definition. Like if we just, we'll tease it out slowly. So
and
I'll make a
that's,
list with you.
yeah, well, we'll keep it very simple. In terms of the operation, it's repetitive, it's ongoing, and it doesn't terminate at the end. So when a car is produced, it's not the end of the activity that contributed to that happening. Whereas with a project, it's temporary, it's unique, and it terminates whenever the objective of that activity is over. How's that, Sam?
That works. And then even though Jonathan yelled at me the other day, because I always talk about process terms and he thinks they're too technical, I have to throw in my process terms there too, because to me, it makes things more clear. So when you take what Jonathan just said and talk about it in a process that's running or a process as a defined series of steps, an operating process happens multiple times. A project process can only occur one time. So just to put that into perspective, a project could last years, 3 years, 5 years. But when you plan it, you're planning for it to be a process that only happens, it only occurs end to end one time or one cycle. Whereas operating or operations processes, you plan them on paper, you have a series of steps that you run, and then as soon as it's done, like Jonathan said, you make the first car, you run the same series of process steps again through another cycle. So an operating process has to cycle multiple times for it to be considered an operation.
And this, many of you, like when we're talking about the waste that exists at an organization and how come there's no return on investment of projects, et cetera, that's a lot more interesting than when Sam and I are getting into definitions. But it's very, very important. Some of these definitions that we're covering, they're fundamental. You really can't start looking and inspecting your own organization until you have some of these basic definitions, because everything that we talked about, transition state, the impact of organizational maturity, everything relies around just a few very critical areas. And one of them is the distinction between your operations and your projects. So just stay with us a little bit on it. And once you do, there's going to be a big payoff in terms of starting to understand and starting to have to look at your organization almost like the matrix, and you're going to start seeing things very, very differently and realizing, oh my gosh, like there's a whole bunch of waste, or that activity can't possibly succeed, et cetera. So I'm just asking you to stay with us a little bit on the definition. Yeah.
Agreed. And you can't build Jonathan and I talk about business science a lot, process science. You can't build on a science unless you have some basic unequivocal blocks to build on, or immutable blocks, let's say foundation pieces. And operations and projects are by far one of the biggest foundation pieces for being able to review business in a consistent way across multiple industries, across any, universally is another big one too, because everything we talk about is not confined to a particular industry or a particular niche. You should be able to walk in to a business and identify its operating processes versus its project processes. Fundamentally, that's not something that they have to tell you, oh, well, this is what we consider ops. And that's what I was saying earlier. You don't want to be in the position where you go into a company as a consultant or a new employee or a new owner, and then they have to tell you what ops means. And that's often what we run into. And that's if that's your premise to start, you have to challenge that. And that's part of this conversation. You have to challenge why that would be and why operations is different in different companies.
And
if that services anything.
Most of the activity that you see at organizations in terms of at the senior level and in terms of communications that are going out, et cetera, are usually happening at the project level, because that's sexy. Operations are not as sexy. And you'll say, well, no, like everyone's talking about like an improvement to our operation. That's a project. When you change anything, we talked about this last time, you're immediately going into a project, whether or not you define it as such. So when we look at things, it's not exciting to just do what you need to be doing necessarily for operations. So I'm going to get into, maybe Sam, let's get straight into like more of what we see in an organizationally mature operation. What do we see of the operation itself? I'm starting to get into like all the activity that's surrounding it and all that waste, but I guess let's stick to the operation.
Yeah, I'm just thinking in the moment if we've covered the definition sufficiently enough to run into the conversation you're having, which is the exciting part, because
let's do it, how everyone feels it. So it's all the people, the employees of the company that are involved in producing whatever value the market is looking for from that company. And I'm using a car manufacturing company, but you could think of anything. And it's basically what's the purpose of the organization and the people that are working directly on the purpose, as opposed to maybe in the periphery or to improve the purpose or improve technology or whatever it is, all this other activity. And it's the day-to-day of what people are doing.
It is that. And the question of value chain is you talked about it. And again, I'm going through this piece slowly before we jump into the other conversation that we want to have, because I don't want to introduce the value chain now and get caught down that rabbit hole. But it is hard to separate them, because when we say, well, don't really say, okay, every revenue generating activity is a operation necessarily. And how would you define revenue generating versus not? We're saying, and maybe we'll explore it in a different podcast or a different conversation. But for you guys who are looking to say, okay, well, how can I understand a universal definition of operations? Operations is all the process that enables the core value production of the company. And that's Jonathan, you were saying that. I'm just kind of reiterating it because I want to make sure we're covering our bases. And even in getting into this conversation, which, sometimes we get into these calls and I feel I don't know exactly if I'm going to be able to button up a topic that seems like I should be able to articulate in a few sentences. So I just want to throw it out there before we glaze over this, that the point is operations should not be different. And now I feel like I'm repeating myself, but but it should
You
not be
know,
different from context to context, and
it
whether
gets
you
to
can
the heart of
understand
it.
it.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
gets to the heart of it. Gets to the, it is, that's so much, be so many definitions to the same exact business terms. But at the end of the day, we're mostly speaking about organizationally immature entities, because that's a majority of entities, even the ones that think they're very, very advanced. Most would not be agile, be considered agile on any level. And so it's really fit for purpose. So in terms of the definition that we're talking about for operations, on one level, we're making sure that we're distinguishing between your day-to-day activity and project work. This is activity that you're spinning up. It's usually discretionary, certainly in an organizationally mature entity. And let's just start getting, Sam, into without getting, I think we've done enough with at least the base definition. It's really, why does this matter? Well, what are some of the critical issues? And I would say that one of the most critical is that I never understood how people spin up projects when they can't even measure or monitor or understand their basic operations. So if you're an organizationally immature entity, your focus, most of it should be on operations. But because organizationally mature entities tend to have so much chaos and have so much variation and have such a low visibility into their actual operations on any meaningful level, it's just not exciting to get into that area and start just measuring things and understanding them better. It's much more exciting to say, oh, we're going to just bring in some big technology. We're going to do all this project work. And so I think one of the first things that I'd like everyone to take away from here is that everyone's focus should really be on operations at the early stage. And you should not be spinning up multiple projects, because if you don't know, and Sam covered this last time, exactly what your as is, your current state, your operations, by definition, any change to them would be unknown and very risky and very dangerous. So I think the first takeaway is focus on operations. And when I say focus, understand exactly what your current state is in all its glory.
Yeah, they're number one. I think that point can't be. It's almost as if you're writing a guidebook for what is an operation. It is your number one priority. And Jonathan just said early stage, but I would even posit it's always. It is what
Oh,
it is. The company. It is the company. Your operation and your operating processes is your lifeblood, right?
100%.
It's your
But
everything. It drives everything.
once you're agile, that's a given that you can measure your operations and you have good visibility into what they are and what's going on. But your first stage is understanding them, really understanding them at every level without tinkering. Because the first thing most people do when they inspect something is they want to change it and they want to solve it and they want to fix it when they don't really fully understand the end to end of it.
Well, and it again comes down to, we're kind of parroting back now. Okay, you manage what you measure, and obviously maturity. I think everyone could agree on a pretty basic level that the more mature an organization is, the better measures they have, the better tools they have to make measurements, make good data, good quality data. This is very much now floating around in the space as, yes, we all want good data and we all want good measurements. But if you need to measure your operations to ensure operating success, it kind of points us back to, what is your operation? And then again, it's that question mark. So just tying again together, you have to measure your operation, but to do that, you have to know what your operation is. So again, using the as is language, you have to know your as is process, but you really first need to know, what is an operation. If you just get into an organization and you can't differentiate project work, operating work, shared services, support work, which is a different type of operation, where are you going to invest in even measuring? And that's the crux of it again, which is why it's so important to know what you're doing. So let's go back to where Jonathan's driving the conversation about, okay, I want to start measuring my operation so I can get better data, make better decisions, know where I'm going with my project portfolio. Okay, let's start. So then how do we start to define the operations you're going to measure. That's the first question, right? And then how do you know in an organization, do you, then it drives us back to where we started. As a consultant or otherwise, you have to say, okay, well, what is it here? Is it
I
what
don't know
you've
if you
just put into ops? Yeah. I'm kind of
uh,
even thinking myself to answer my own question, but go ahead and jump in. I mean, where do people
well,
normally
it
start if you
starts
don't
with
know?
mapping. You got to map what it is, what's the activity, what's your value stream, and what's the activity that contributes to it. You need to map it. I think that's basic. You can't measure something if you don't know the different points along its path. So you can measure output, you can measure quality, you can measure a lot of things, but when we're talking about knowing your operations, we're saying be able to visualize exactly what activity is occurring.
Yeah. And that is, again, the subject of a lot of process improvement, at least classic process improvement. You're talking about Lean or Six Sigma, which is making sure you're measuring the right things. And from John and I's perspective, measuring the right things means measuring your operations first. From a lot of people's perspective, since they're not talking about trying to universalize the definition of operation, it's go ahead and trace the value. And that's another way we've been talking about it, trace the value from where it starts all the way through the customer. And if you're putting on measures of creating that, you're creating a good proxy set of measures that's going to tell you if you're doing what's right to keep your general operations moving. Because if the customer is unhappy, they're going to stop buying, the operations are going to start withering, and the company's going to start dying. So if you start with a customer centric view first, you can define operations from that way. But the point is, when you start doing that exercise, you're going to find that all operating processes have fundamental similarities. Goes back to the repetitive nature. They're budgeted to run many cycles over and over. They can be measured in a certain way, and they have stable teams typically. So picking that out first, then you have to start separating the projects away from it, and then you have to start measuring the operations. And if you get to that point, then we get back to the fascinating thing that Jonathan's talking about, where, okay, now every piece of activity that a person does or an organization does that's not in that operating bucket is what? Well, it's rogue project activity or organized project activity, depending on how you would classify it or what you're observing.
And 9 out of 10 times when an entity does get serious about understanding its operations in any dimension, the second they see any problem, and you're going to see a lot of problems, that they lack the discipline to do nothing about it to start, or at least nothing that inherently is going to change the operation. So usually what happens is the second they start looking at where they are, before they really have an understanding of where they are, they start making changes. And this people do, you could relate to this, in your own environment. If you start thinking about what you're doing, you're going to see an inefficiency and immediately think, oh, I should change this. It could be something as simple as what's your process for, starting work in the morning and opening up the different applications you need, et cetera. And you realize if you really take a step back, you say, oh, okay, this is how I do it. Oh, that doesn't make full sense. But then you can get quickly down a rabbit hole of spending your entire day, instead of doing work, reorganizing your apps, reorganizing your workstation, et cetera. And that's exactly the same thing that companies do. Instead of just finishing, let me understand what it is, they before they even get there, they're starting to go down rabbit holes of multiple different efforts to improve it and change it. And that's another reason organizations that are immature remain immature, because they're constantly in flux. They don't have the discipline to be very selective about any change. So I would say that that's one of maybe the second precept that maybe we're getting across today.
Well, and that would be, if I had to summarize this, operations will always require changes over time. It's kind of you could say that's a law. So as soon as you make a stable operation or you have a great idea and you plug it up to customers and you start making money and you start repeating it over and over, it's already starting to have pressure to change. And that's for every company, every process that's ever been created in an operating state. And what Jonathan's saying is how you make those changes, how you control those changes is going to be a matter of maturity, effectiveness, efficiency, all the good things versus all sort of the bad things you would associate in a business context, is going to first start with how you understand that this happens. Because if you think, okay, I have people doing the same thing over and over, and as the market changes, as the competitive landscape changes, as new technology becomes available, cost pressure mounts because of various factors internally, the operation is going to need to change. Now, are your people who are doing that operating process every day, day in and day out, are they given a particular budget so that they can step out of that role and change the process? And that's what Jonathan's saying when, okay, I'm starting to research productivity apps, or I'm starting to make changes and I need to put energy into that. That costs money, that costs time. So how are you accounting for that? Are you saying every change that needs to be made has to be in a formal project structure and has to be budgeted as a project? Are you giving people the time to do mini projects that you're just sanctioning passively? We don't really think about it that way. That almost sounds awkward to talk about. But again, knowing operation, what it is, fundamentally, knowing a project, what it is, it's a change to the operation. They have to be in balance, and they're going to be different, happening in different frequencies at different companies, different industries. But there's no way to avoid that
And
relationship.
I opened up this podcast with saying that we're not against consultants or anything, but I found myself coming back a little bit in that if I'm looking at an organizationally an entity that's immature, one of the first things that I'm going to be doing is I want to hear from the clients, the customers, and I want to hear from the people that are actually engaged in whatever value producing processes there are. The problem is most project work is the purview of management and leadership, and the consultants are working with them on the ideas. So they're selling solutions to problems that management's identifying, but the real people that have the most input that is valuable, and of course, in any engagement, usually the consultants might get to the different, representatives of the line people and might go to a client or two, et cetera. But in fact, that's all that matters because everything starts at that level with the people actually engaged in the process, not with all the high ideas. Because if you are organizationally mature and you don't know your operations at a real fundamental level, you shouldn't be making massive changes or big changes without understanding what the impact could be. And the only people that actually know what's going on are the people that are actually doing the day in and day work. In fact, a lot of times when I visualize a company, there's the people that are actually doing the work that don't, that are kind of totally disconnected from decisions that are made up high. And then there's all this other activity that's surrounding it, sometimes making their jobs harder, sometimes making it easier for, on some level, but never really in sync with it. So I don't know, Sam, if that's something you could relate to at all.
Well, definitely. I was actually just about to out myself because from a consulting perspective, I don't know how it happens all the time, to Jonathan's point, where a consultant or anyone will come into an organization and the focal work is the projects that are going wrong, or they're not happening right, or they're not being accepted by the business, or they're over budget, or they're what have you. But then the first step is not to say, okay, well, what is the operation? What is the operation we're trying to impact? What are we trying to affect? This is the as is process work that we keep evangelizing. Because if you don't do that, anything you're doing is just random. You're not going to be able to see what the impact is you're trying to have, the change you're trying to make. As a consultant, when I said I was going to out myself, when I go on site, I can talk with the executives who say, here's the problem, here's what's going on. But to me, it's kind of like a lot of whomping because the first step I'm going to say, no matter what they put to me, is, okay, well, I got to go scope out what the operation is that we're talking about here, where there's a purported problem, and talk to the people who are doing it. No question. It doesn't even matter. Like the top part is just people trying to feel good about what they're working on, the high level conversations. And I'm being a little flip, but actually not that far from the truth. I mean, it doesn't matter what they say. Every engagement I do starts with talking to the operating folks. And that's what Jonathan's saying. And I have to know who they are and where they are. That's relevant. But they're the only people that actually matter, the ones who are hands on the ground doing the thing that we need to be impacting.
And the crazy part is that that management won't deign to worry about implementing some massive solution, some massive ERP or whatever it is, when anyone at the entity could say, well, there's no two teams that do anything fully alike, or we don't even know what the person next to us does. We're, talk about silos, we're only in silos here. Well, just think about that logically. If everyone's doing something different, then how would the same single system or how would any kind of change be predictable? It can't be. In fact, it could be, for all you could be destroying the very value you're trying to create. So not very sexy, again, to spend too much time on the as is and understanding at a meaningful level what's going on. But when we say understanding it, everyone will say, well, we know the problems. Everyone complains about X, our customers say our quality, has problems, No, that's not understanding your operations. That's not at a meaningful level. You're seeing symptoms and you're reacting to symptoms, but that's not the same as mapping a process and actually understanding what the components of that process are and being able to measure it. Because if you can't measure it because there's so much chaos going on, then by definition, you have a big problem. By definition, you do not actually know your operations.
Yeah, or if you can't see how it all fits together, to your point, that's another big one where I've seen this a ton of times where business owners, in let's say smaller companies as an example demographic, they actually have a ton of great ideas. Like at any given time, if I'm consulting for a smaller or medium business, they have a list of 50 ideas, and a high percentage of them are actually good. The issue is when they start, okay, let's get it done. Then they go down on the floor, and then after the first person says, but you didn't think about this, or it's going to break this, and then the second person says, but what about this? We would need a little more attention here, or a little more thought about how this is going to impact X, Y, and Z. Then they just get stymied, and they don't know what to do from there, because it's not as easy as going in and just pressing a button and the entire process shifts around that change. So then it's kind of an issue of, okay, even if the idea is a good one, if you don't have your finger on operations, and to Jonathan's point, the flow, the volume of things, the actual impact, the cost of each step, how one step is impacted by another, what are the dependencies, you're never going to be able to make a change. And even though the same people that were able to stop your project from occurring, and I know that some of you resonate with this, the great ideas get stopped when it gets to the people on the ground. Ultimately, you didn't ask them in the first place, what is the operation? What do you need? It's oftentimes the people, they have the stop button more often than you think, but they're never consulted in what is actually the problem in the first place, or what is the operation? What does it need? Where is it going? And that's the main
And,
disconnect.
and then you wonder, well, then, okay, yes. I mean, a lot of companies, even my company doesn't, you might be saying, doesn't have a good handle, at that level of their operations. But when, let's say you're in the retail area, if there's a solution that all other retail entities in that industry are using, some technology, something, then it almost seems like, well, of course we should be too, whatever it is, of course, that's a safe one. Like if everyone else is using X or something like X, then we should be too. No, because you don't know in your specific instance if you're ready to absorb that change, or if maybe there's something else that's much more important, or what the unintended consequences of that change might occur. So I guess what I'm saying is that even if you have a solution or have ideas that are something that everyone in your space is doing, and this is really, I think, how a lot of ideas come about from management, because they read an article on something big that's coming along, et cetera. And then they think, okay, well, of course we should have that. And that's how these massive projects get spun up without having any understanding whether or not that's the primary thing that they should be focused on, or maybe it should be, but then understanding that, well, we can't, as we said in an earlier podcast, tack on too much or have a big portfolio, et cetera. But again, the focus has to be on supporting your operations, and supporting your operations is not constantly changing them.
Well, that's the opposite. Constantly changing them is the opposite of supporting them. And that leads to another big thing. Jonathan's always going back towards his PTSD about system implementation and talking about these big system projects. But the thing is, knowing operations and projects, that even itself, knowing the definition, is going to stop a lot of ill-begotten system implementations, right? Because we see this all the time where people say, I want the best new Salesforce. I need the best new Workday. I need the best project management system. I need the best workflow engine. And I'm saying that last one slowly, because what are we trying to put these systems in for, even at a high level? So not even comparing to, okay, is this the change we need right now? Is this the problem we need right now? But I can't tell you how many people try to put a project management system in place because they've heard it's the best one on the market to fix their operations. But I know, like, I see Jonathan smiling, and I could be smiling too if it wasn't so sad. And half of the project work that I see day in and day out, which is that this system's not working for us. That's because you took a project management software and tried to run your operations through it. But why do people do this?
Well, it starts with, and it really does, the lack of definitions around it, because people think that a project is really what we call it. So if we say it's a project and we formally announce something, whatever, that's a project. What we're saying is, because it's definitional, And because there is no, it's not a matter of what different people ascribe to it, it's definitional. Many times there are projects going on, or you enter a project state, even though you're not calling it a project. And that's what Sam mentioned earlier, shadow projects and the like. It's not that people think they're doing a project. They don't realize, and we covered this last, a couple of times ago, any change to something is already starting to head down the path of a project. So at the end of the day, and then it brings in all the things we talked about all the activation energy and all the things that are required for that to have any chance of success. So the worst part is if you're not defining it, what you're tending to do is you're having all these projects without even attempting to do all the things that give any project a chance of success.
Yeah, and that means the success rate is mostly zero for that stuff, which is a whole nother topic. But the point again about knowing what the processes are, I think I should make it more tangible. Because what Jonathan's talking about, where you have operations and project elements getting mixed up and confused all the time, it's actually worse and most ubiquitous at the same time in shared services. So your HR, your finance, some of your support departments. And an easy way to think about it is, let's just use a finance example. Finance, for any organization at any scale, they're constantly running projects for themselves and the business. And they're constantly running an operating function, doing invoicing, doing bookkeeping, doing, whatever kind of AP, AR, whatever your main processes are. Those are the processes that are happening every day, day in and day out. Now, you would think, if you were thinking about it, well, let's say for accounts payable, or I'm doing invoice matching, or something that every company does. I'm going to go ahead and go get the best project management system on the market to do accounts payable. Does that sound funny to anybody? Well, it would be, because that wouldn't make any sense. Nobody would try to do that. You have systems out there that are operations driven, that are driven to help with these things, like regular ERPs or finance systems. They have these functions. No one would ever think to do that, but we do this in the reverse all the time. Just like finance is now working on a big billing upgrade for the company, or they're upgrading their system. That is clearly a project. Then are you going to go and say, okay, well, to help us structure this giant billing upgrade, we're going to use QuickBooks to help us organize the project. Well, nobody would do that either. But when it's not that clear cut, like if you're talking about marketing or you're talking about HR stuff, people lose sight of this so easily. They don't know what the process are they're trying to change. They don't know what they're trying to action, and they're constantly pulling wrong systems, wrong people, wrong staff, wrong budget. But these things are happening constantly. So I don't know. That to me is it's a poignant example to me on how you got to have the right solution, or even start talking about it for the right kind of process. But if you don't have that right, if you can't label the process, you can't even start.
And that gets to, how is that, even remotely possible? It's remotely possible because the first measure that any company should know of its operations is what they cost. And because most entities don't have this hard and fast distinction between operations and projects, or don't actually understand their operations, or don't see how many projects are already occurring within what they think are their operations, because of that, there's a lot of extra budget that's all over the place in most organizations. And I would also warrant that most organizations have better margins than they realize. And it's logical, it has to be, because if we're saying that all this waste exists and everyone's reporting what their profits are, and they're not at any given time saying, oh yes, I need to account for the 52 projects that are going to fail, and that's all waste, and that would otherwise be profit, which is actually how they should be thinking about it. But because they're not accounting for any of that, there's all this extra money floating around. And everyone always complains, we need more budget, we need more budget. But they already have enough budget to do a lot of extra activity, and that's creating even more waste and making it even harder to start addressing some of the problems we're talking about.
And that again, just to reinforce it, it's all that activity that's happening under operating budget or within operating teams who are managing operating processes, who just have the leeway or the expectation that they're going to take on this change work when it comes up, but they're not given any structure, tools, or support. So to Jonathan's point, it's just eating budget, because ideas start to coalesce, they start to get a little momentum, but without structure or capability or support, they just fizzle into nothing the majority of the time. But you still bake it into your budget because their people are still doing these things. So really their focus and capacity for their operating responsibilities might be 70 or 60 or 50%. Because now after a few years, Greg is the most gung-ho person in our operating team, and he's always got the idea guy. So now he's been promoted. So only 50% of his time is doing activity, and the other 50% is working on ideas. But the ideas are not structured or supported well. So now you're just putting 50% of a valuable resource and just putting it towards things that he can never achieve on his own, that he can never have any action, like true ROI on. And sorry, all the Gregs out there, it's not to say that you're not trying and you're not adding maybe some value or moving the needle a little bit, but not if you were more supported and everyone knew what your time was split between doing and what you're trying to achieve. And I think that's the fundamental difference we're talking about.
COVID was very interesting. I think if COVID would have had the financial impact that we thought, or like many crises do, it does force people to think, what does it cost us to turn on and off the lights every day? And then, where do we cut? And, the funny thing about, as another indicator, I'll just throw out there about the obviousness of how much waste there is the whole issue about when there are layoffs announced and Wall Street's reaction to that. Now we could talk about the statistics on the long term, et cetera, but generally Wall Street looks favorably on it, at least if it's planned, and I don't know how you say, planned, or it's offensive as opposed to reactive, but putting all that aside, the main reason is because everyone knows that there's tons of waste in every single organization. So that's a reflection of that. So the reason I'm bringing that up in this context is because just from a basic finance perspective, you need to know what it costs to run your business. And everyone's like, oh, that's very simplistic, in terms of how you're looking at it. And it's much more complicated than that. No, not when it comes to what your operations are. That's very, very critical, because everything else is discretionary to a large extent, whether you realize it or not.
A good example of what we're talking about is if you actually prescribe to what we're saying, your core operation is creating the units of value that the customer is buying. Let's go ahead and time the labor and the actual material cost to create one widget of value. It could be a service, it could be a product. Well, if you have an operating team and you've calculated that it costs literally labor and cost, raw cost is $10 a unit, and your average budget for the operation is $35 a unit because of how much you're paying the team, there's a big gap there of unexplained activity. What is all that activity? That's the interstitial space. You could very clearly define an operation from a process perspective. It doesn't mean that you can, and if you can't account for the cost, it's all uncontrolled project work. It's just pure waste, people milling about the office, maybe physical constraints, but there's a lot of activity in there. And that's, if you just put the numbers to it, what Jonathan's talking about is this margin, this incredible margin. We all know it, and we all talk about it, but how do you harvest it? Well, you need to make sure your changes are handled effectively with the proper measures and controls, and your operations are handled effectively with the correct measures and controls. There is nothing else. I think if one thing, as we start to wrap up here, you can challenge yourself to your own organization is operations and projects are the two fundamental process types. There is nothing beside that. So if you look at a given team or a situation and you're cataloging all the activity, it's got to fall in one or the other. There's not this mysterious type of activity that happens in the interstitial space. There's obviously nuance, but you've got to be able to define it and classify and categorize, or you can't work with it.
And we're not minimizing the difficulty maybe in starting to apply it and distinguish between the two, or to really measure and define your operations, especially when they could be very variable. But if entities would just start thinking of it like that and start applying it at the high level. So at the high level, okay, what are we including in our operations, and how are we defining that, and what are we calling a project? Like, you're already getting light years ahead, because you're starting to realize the decision points and the inflection points when activity that has a good chance of failure, or it could be success, but not if you have multiple of them, is beginning. And so I think, even if at the application level, in the very specific, it's a challenge, there's a huge value in understanding the concepts that we're talking about, even at the high level.
Exactly. And Jonathan started this podcast by throwing me the football, and I just let it hit me square in the face when he said define operations. I mean, it's such a important topic. So I don't want to. The biggest thing is whether you say, okay, there's a definition that's going to fit in every purpose. The thing that you really need to internalize is there is a definition that's applicable, and it's functional. It's not just this is ops, and we just throw it in the bag and just call it whatever we want. It's a functional definition that helps you categorize a type of business activity that needs to be managed a certain way can only take specific systems to support it. And it has certain characteristics, like we talked about how it's going to inevitably need change, and it's going to need maintenance, and it's going to need management in certain ways and types. Like you don't put a project manager to manage an operation. You have to have an operations manager. So the point is, you've got to challenge what is the definition? What all is that encompassed, and why is it separated? And you've got to ask yourself if you could separate all the activity in your business by these definitions.
And we'll post a couple of things after the podcast so that, along with this podcast, so that everyone can start getting a little grounded. But I think, Sam, I think that's a good first cut at, I think, one of the harder topics, and maybe one of the less sexy or
Yeah,
interesting topics, but very, very foundational if you want to start being effective.
for sure. And yeah, it definitely won't be the last time we talk about operations, because like we said, it's everything. It's what drives your business. So with that, we look forward to having more riveting conversations about operations versus projects at some other time. So thanks a lot.